Hello and welcome to the HR.com Excellence in Practice program. My name is Alex Poulos and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer of Net Dimensions and a board member for HR.com's Technology-Enabled Learning program. It is my pleasure today to welcome Jeremy Blain, Managing Director of Sayco at Asia Pacific. Jeremy is joining us all the way from Singapore, and I've had the chance to work with Jeremy in Asia for a number of years now. And he's not only an executive with a deep knowledge and expertise in our industry, but also someone with tremendous passion about learning and its impact. Jeremy, welcome.
Thanks.
Before we get started, can you tell us a few things about Sayco and what we're up to currently?
Sure. Well, Sayco is a European training organization, and I use the word training. We provide learning and development solutions, but really training has been our heartland since about 1926, and I think that makes us one of the oldest established training companies in the world. We focus on the development of managers and teams, so professional, personal development everywhere in the world. That's soft skills training, if you like, but I don't know about you, Alex, but I hate that terminology. These are the tough skills of business, you know, how you negotiate, how you manage someone, how you have an appraisal discussion, all of these kind of things. Because of our scale as well, we're the largest of our kind in Europe. We do operate multinationally, and for me, working in Asia for the last kind of 3 to 4 years now, it's an absolutely fascinating, fast-moving place where learning really is at the heart of the agenda. So for me, I'm seeing things that perhaps we've seen before in the US and in Europe, but also I'm seeing the pace of change hugely accelerated over here in terms of things like technology-enabled learning, and I'm sure we'll touch on that later on.
Definitely. I hope you'll share some of those insights that you're seeing in Asia in our conversation. Now, you have worked with hundreds of learning organizations, if not thousands actually, in your position. So what would you say are the key characteristics of a learning organization?
It's a good question, that, you know, and I think these days it boils down to being far more commercially savvy and understanding that human capital sits as part of the balance sheet these days. And if it's on your balance sheet, it's being measured every month. And if it's being measured every month, it needs to be managed and grown in a way that perhaps over the last 5 years with the GFC, we've had some delays behind, let's call them. So that's the first step, the recognition that it's at the heart of the balance sheet and therefore needs to be treated as an investment and as a key asset within our business. If you're having that mentality, then another thing that I would suggest, and particularly that we see here over in Asia, and maybe starting to creep in elsewhere, is that the lines between talent and employees are starting to kind of merge a little bit. So it's a far more inclusive approach. How do we grow the broader organization, not just focus on the talent? The talent is important, of course, for the pipeline, but I'm seeing a much broader, bigger picture approach, which suggests that everybody can contribute to the business, and that's a very key characteristic for me, particularly now because part of those things that you're developing also are reliant on attitude within a learning organization, a willingness to constantly transform itself, not just for competitive advantage, but obviously to attract, recruit, retain key talent, and not just doing that once. The other characteristic, of course, is that these days that change is a constant, and if organizations, and particularly learning organizations, get behind that, then that's when learning becomes a constant also, and the development of the whole, not just pockets of individuals within the organizations themselves.
That's a great definition. I think you're touching at some key points like, you know, data, change, and also talent for everyone. This is great. Our theme today is about impact. How would you define, you know, impact in those types of organizations?
From a learning perspective, you mean, Alex? Yes. Yeah. I think from a learning impact perspective, I think that has to start from the very beginning these days. For us here, if we go back to some of the learning organisation points that I'm talking about, us as learning organisations, like ourselves, we have to be far more commercially focused and operationally realistic as we're engaging with an organisation. Impact starts when you go in to define needs, from my point of view. If you can start to define needs and understand the real outcomes and the real reasons behind why I'm being asked to come in to say, give us some sales training, or we need some management development. If you can get to the root causes rather than reacting and treating what might be symptoms because we're being asked, that's the first part where we can impact the organisation. That's about the creation of value within the learning organisation. And that's a joint approach. That's not just a learning organisation like ourselves coming in and talking to the L&D HR professionals. It's about a co-produced program or solution through the clear definition of what the needs are and what the problem is that needs to be fixed. And from that point on, you then start to make everything far more appropriate. You base everything on the outcomes. You start to think about, well, what is achievable based on these objectives, and of course what's affordable these days as well. Well, that is always going to be there, particularly now after kind of 3 to 5 years of relative tightness in terms of budget. And learning impact, I think, and impact within these organisations has changed somewhat over the last 5 years because of the financial crisis and because budgets have been constrained. So making learning more appropriate and getting the right delivery methodologies in place, making it more inclusive, affordable and achievable, therefore, is one of the key things. The other things in terms of impact are those that I think we all would appreciate, which is about the alignment of line managers and the support of a senior leader. It's not just about line managers anymore. I believe it's about, from the very top down, the sponsorship of the appropriate learning. Once you've got the appropriate learning in place, you have to think about these days what is the appropriate delivery methodology. With technology-enabled learning, the growth of blended learning, growth of particularly what we're seeing in Asia, the growth of group coaching and individual coaching, it's blurring the lines between what was a traditional, let's say, 2-day classroom training and what it could be these days, to make sure that it's far more practical and workplace applied, which gives it the greatest impact, of course. If you then wrap around all of that an appropriate measurement, and in simple terms that could be a diagnostic, which is based on what are the capabilities that we're trying to build based on the competency framework of that audience, and start to measure it at the beginning and as you go through the process, you're putting in milestones not just for the individuals going through the learning, but for the line managers also to get behind and get to really involved in the embedding of the learning in the workplace. The way we look at that is, as part of the learning solution, putting together a charter for success, we would call it, which is bringing together all stakeholders, that is the learning professionals within the organisation itself, the line managers and senior level sponsor, learner champions and learner themselves, and getting them behind the promise of what is going to be delivered, and therefore the commitment that each one of them has within there, not just in terms of the learning itself, but the learning impact at the end game. And in order to do that, the final piece of the jigsaw is having the learners involved from day one also, so that they champion the process. If it always appears to be a top-down process, sometimes I think the impact can wane a little bit. Learner champions is the way from that point of view.
Yeah. No, I really like the focus on the learner. Now, with that in mind, what program or initiative, as an example, have you been most proud of that had a direct impact on some of your clients' organizations?
Right. Well, have you ever interviewed somebody and they said, you know, it's really different over here where I am. You might not understand it, but it's really different and we do learning in different ways. Well, let me tell you, in Asia, it really did start to challenge me in terms of how we do some of these roles. It's really different over here, you know, Alex. Actually, you know what, I'm going to come back on that, say it's not so different. I think as a Westerner coming over here, I was very conscious of being the flexible one. I'm dealing with organisations from India to the Pacific, half of the world's population, I'm active in 14 countries. You've got the cultural elements, you've got multi-generational mix in very kind of large swings, like in India, for example, the average age of the workforce is 28, which is pretty incredible. Whereas if I move east to Korea and Japan, it's an aging population and a more experienced workforce where the challenge lies. So impact means, first of all, is that you really have to understand the audience and the frame within which the learning is going to sit. And for us over here, I think the biggest impact we're having is a multi-country rollouts through an understanding that while we should be thinking globally in terms of the corporate entity, learning locally is really the way that it's going to have the greatest impact, and that's through experience. So one example I can give is the competitive playground out here in Asia is bringing a lot of focus on sales training, and I don't really mean high-end sales training either. There's been a lack of the basics of selling here for some time from what I've observed over the last 3 years, and particularly because, of course, we all know that selling and the way we sell has changed anyway significantly over the last 5-10 years. So, you know, those organizations that are still kind of peddling the same sales programs that they did 10-15 years ago, I think are guilty of letting learners down in some ways. The world's changed, the world's shrunk, we're globalized, we're mobilized, selling can be different, selling can be done more remotely as well as face-to-face. And this is really at the heart of how we approach learning over here. So this sales program that we had in place was for a Japanese company who for the first time was rolling out a significant portion of training outside of their country. And I'm sure you'll know, and the audience will know here, that the Japanese domestic market has been flat or kind of declining slightly over the last few years, and therefore there's far greater view of the internationalization, not just for large corporations but for small, medium enterprise as well. This is providing challenges for them, but it's also providing huge opportunities. And you know, one thing that I would say when you're talking about learning measurement and getting learning impact is my advice would be to think Japanese, because it's really challenged us as an organization. Everybody within the organization at senior level, right through to the management and right through to the learners, are involved from day one, and you are measured on it month on month. For example, in the program that I'll tell you a little bit about, is that I had to go to Tokyo with the MD of the Asia Pacific region and review what has happened in terms of putting the training together, delivering the training, impact in the workplace, sales manager interactions, and impact on behaviors and results as we went through. So we had some really bold measurement steps in place. So the sales program was across direct sales teams and dealer teams. So for the first time it brought together two lots of audiences together, really, the direct organization itself and then their channel network. The whole program was topped and tailed with a 180 assessment based on the core competencies that were going to be delivered. So not on the current competency framework that was in place, but actually on the skills that the organization wanted the salespeople to display over the next 3 to 5 years, which I thought was a very clever approach, actually. So we helped them put together the questionnaires and the assessment that sits behind that. That happened before the program. There was optional e-learning in place to make it a fully blended program, and then a robust, and I think some of you would be shocked that this is in place still for now in some parts of the world, but a 4-day training course, very intensive practical training course, which was paralleled with a sales management training course, which was not a generic management training course, but actually took the core tools from the sales program and took the sales managers through it in a way that gave them coaching toolkit for each step of the way. So built their coaching skills for sure, but actually gave them tips for every tool and technique which we had in place, peppered by role plays over a very, very intense 3-day period. Now, when we kind of looked at some of the measures that were in place, if I fast forward now to to get through the detail. First of all, when we evaluate the training, we look at Net Promoter Score within our organisation. The average Net Promoter Score across this programme at the moment, bearing in mind that we've rolled out across in 7 countries and touched over 700, 800 people in the last couple of years on this, is 9.2, which is, of course, as you know, is exactly what you're aiming for in terms of an aggressive Net Promoter Score where everybody is buying into it. Immediately after the program, KPIs have been changed and modified as we've been through it, and therefore a measurement step for individual sales reps and their managers is in place as well. 6 to 9 months on, depending on the teams and depending on the country, we then put in the second 180 degree feedback to make sure then we're tracking not just how people are moving in terms of their job role competencies that I talked about, but also their behaviours. So within this 180 we've mixed frequency of new behaviours as well as the defined job role competencies, which means that when we go every month and when we're kind of reviewing to the board in Japan, we're really able to pick up to say, look, here's how people are changing in terms of their will, mindset and behaviour. Here's how it's impacting how people are doing their job, and here's how it's impacting results. And we've literally just done the review of 2014, and from a flat sales drive and sales performance, 2014 grew double-digit growth for the first time in 2 to 3 years for this organisation. And I can't sit here as a learning organisation and that was all because of the training. It wasn't, of course. It's to do with the sales managers. It's to do with the whole changes in the organisation. But the organisation is telling me that they attribute just over half of that growth to this training directly and all of those things that are in place. And the measurement for us is that we've now been granted a global rollout. The first time this is for a non-Japan sourced training company, because it was sourced in Asia Pacific, has been done that. So I think all of that coming together, all of these people, all of the stakeholders in place, all of these measurements and steps has given us the greatest impact I've ever seen in a training that we've done. So apologies, it took a bit of a time, but there's quite a lot of elements in this, but I'm sure you can see the impact it's had.
Listen, it's a great example, so I appreciate the detail, and I think you covered my next question, which is about measuring things and how you measure impact, and we talked about Net Promoter Score, 180 degree assessments, KPIs, and behavioral measurements as well as tying that to business outcomes and business results, which is great.
Yeah.
Now,
yeah.
I'm sorry, anything you want to add to that?
Well, actually, the other thing I didn't mention in there, which was a great kind of measurement step, was setting up a learner community. We've done this a few times, and I'm sure you're familiar, some of you, with things like Yammer communities, online communities, whereby you can build either the learning cadres that have been in place or kind of the whole group that have been through this and start to share best practices and stories. Well, actually, after 3 months and after 6 months, we had refresher clinics in each of the different countries, whereby the line managers co-facilitated with our facilitators in here to share best practices, share success stories, and also tackle difficulties and problems and workshop problems that we're through or common problems to the group, so that then you're not just enforcing the learning, but you're actually then evolving how people are going back, and it really kept the motivation of the sales team in place. The online community is more or less self-generating at the moment and self-owned. It's great. When I go on it, I see kind of lots of comments like coming on. It's the first groups now, those comments start to track down a bit, but that's been a really key part, and I think that goes back to what I said before, Alex, about the learners being a part of it from day one and really championing the process and feeling like they're owning it. That's been a key element.
I agree. This is wonderful. Now, my last question, and I promise I will hold you accountable for that, is how do you see learning technologies evolving in the next 5 years?
Oh gosh, what a question!
Yes.
What a question!
There you go.
Yeah, well, as you know, and maybe those listening to this, you may not know, but Sagos is very committed to research and development within our marketplace. So we do a lot of learning trend surveys across the world. I've just finished the 2015 Asia Pacific Workplace Learning, where we see a lot of different data coming through versus US versus Europe, and a lot of it is based on kind of technologies and learning technologies. So I think the question might be answered subtly different for where you are around the world, but you know, if I tell you what I'm seeing over here, where I feel the pace of change is just at such an accelerated rate, you're really going to keep on top of it. We've got two key themes that are kind of impacting, if you like, the role of work and learning in the next 5 years. The 2020 workplace, you'll see an increased cross-generational mix in the workplace, and you'll see a greater degree of technology and mobilization of devices, etc., etc. So iGen will be coming into the workplace, and you also have a bigger problem here in Asia, not just that younger generation coming in, but the aging population and how to integrate them, keep them integrated back into the workforce as well. And the key question is, well, you know, the workplace is going to be different and technology is going to be a really big part of it, so how can you leverage that across the generational mix? I think those two are the key questions. When I look at what's happening here in Asia Pacific, it's really, really interesting compared to some other parts in the world. For example, tablets, so your devices, your tablets, be it Android or iOS, tablets are the #1 technology for accessing e-learning and mobile learning over in this region. Whereas if I compare it to Europe, it's still, and to a certain extent in the US as well, it's more about desktop laptops still, because of the traditional journey that has been happening. So what we're seeing here in Asia, we're seeing a leapfrog effect. We're seeing the fact that while some of the economies here in Asia are still emerging, they were able to learn from the mature economies like North America and in Europe, and actually take the best of what's happened and start to integrate it in what they're doing. And that is no more evident than in learning and development over here. And some of the key data that has come out, which is ahead of our surveys in Europe, is that over 50% of the workforce here are enjoying blended learning, and 59% of the workforce are started doing online learning, be that e-learning or mobile learning, through a mobile device. So that's a very, very big shift. And when you compare it to Europe, for example, that's way ahead of Europe, where you still have a bigger mix of classroom. So, you know, if you take those two key things in together, technology, you can be forgiven, is going to kind of take over everything. You know, suddenly we get these surveys. We see, you know, tablets on the rise. We see people accessing e-learning here, etc., etc. But then a curious piece of data came through from Generation Y, and I was doing this yesterday, and I had to kind of reread it. Generation Y was the most vocal population that said, you know what, we want more of the human touch. So I think one of the dangers about the role of technology in the next 5 years is that organizations and individuals like ourselves would think that we have to do everything with technology. Well, I'm kind of here to say that actually the human heart of the business and learning and work is alive and well, and it won't go away. Technology, from what we're seeing in our surveys here and in Europe actually, and to a certain extent from what I've seen from a recent survey in the States, suggests that technology is not replacing if you like, the human touch. It's enhancing it. So it's giving us a much greater solutions portfolio for work and for learning, and it's the mix which is important. And I think that's why we're seeing such a growth from a learning perspective in blended learning over here. It's taking the best of what's out there at the moment, if you like, the greatest hits of learning at the moment, some face-to-face elements, a growth of coaching. We'll take some of that kind of new generation e-learning, which seems to be working, smaller bite mobile learning, peppering it with on-the-job learning and some of the human touch and more community-focused learning, like I was talking about before. And I think that's where we're going. We're not going to get away from the fact that technology is going to continue to evolve. And I think one of the dangers within what I've just said is that some of those organizations, and we see it here particularly, some of those organizations that feel that they're behind in integrating technologies into their workplace or into their learning, could be guilty of moving into what is the next fad or fashion in terms of the best technologies for communities or for communities of practice or for e-learning, etc., rather than thinking about what's right for the organization. Mm-hmm. I know I was guilty of this ourselves. I think a few years ago I was trying to get into Twitter, then it was like, okay, actually Tumblr would be better for me, then Pinterest would be good for me, without understanding that these are kind of, particularly Pinterest at the time was very specific to an industry. So from what we're seeing out there in our own journey of making a few mistakes along the way is the role of technologies is certainly going to be there over the next 5 years. The key, though, will to understand is what is the goal that you have in your organization in terms of the work or the learning that you want to integrate technologies into. Therefore, what is the most appropriate technologies to use? What is the most appropriate technology to use across the generations? I think with the iGen or Gen Z coming into the workplace in the next sort of 5 years, which is a frightening prospect in itself, they will expect something quite different. And I think one of the key changes we'll see from a technology point of view with them in the workplace is the death of email. If I look at that generation right now, how they operate and how they message, I'm just kind of talking about my own kids really, which are kind of 12, 13 as well, and kind of what I see around is that email is not their tool of choice. It's messaging apps like things like WhatsApp, for example. This, I think, will become a more prevalent technology for us to use to have more instant short-form messaging, but also develop communities which support those, if you like, those communities of practice or learning within organizations. So I think a number of these things are going to come together. The benefits are about efficiency and productivity and ownership right through the organization. The risks are getting the right thing in place, otherwise it could be costly and it could turn people off those, I reckon. But it's a very broad answer to a very broad question, I'm afraid.
But I appreciate it. I mean, and Jeremy, this was absolutely great, and I totally love the perspective from a different part of the world and how things work there and what matters and what doesn't. So once more, a true pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks very much for the invite. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise. This concludes our Excellence in Practice interview with Jeremy Blain of Sayco. Thank you all for joining. Goodbye.